The bustling noise of the resort office was drowned out by the sound of Jack's footsteps echoing in the hallway. His new identity, carefully crafted with a short, unkempt beard and a plain polo shirt, made him look like just another frustrated employee trying to escape a dead-end career. But in reality, Jack, Stephen J. Kubek, the CEO of Diamond Resorts International, was here to do something no one would expect, to go undercover and see what really went on behind the doors of his vast empire. "You're sure about this, Steve?" his security guard Dale asked, his voice heavy with skepticism as they passed by the front desk. Kubek gave a brief nod, his heart racing. This wasn't just a corporate visit. This was a deep dive into the heart of his company, one that would either break him or make him understand just how deep the problems went. "If I don't do this, I'll never know what's actually happening down there." As he walked into the maintenance room for his first shift, a wave of awkwardness washed over him. The workers glanced up, their eyes narrowing in disbelief as he clumsily fumbled with his tool belt. They weren't used to someone like him, someone who didn't know the first thing about fixing pipes, let alone repairing a broken light fixture. One of the workers, Randy, a seasoned maintenance guy with a permanent frown etched into his face, grunted in his direction. "You sure you know what you're doing, man? 'Cause this ain't a place for rookies." Jack, Kubek of course, forced a smile. "I'm here to learn," he muttered, trying to hide his nervousness. He had no idea what he was doing, but the last thing he wanted was to look weak in front of the team. Randy scoffed and handed him a wrench, his rough hands calloused from years of hard work. "Good luck," he said before turning back to his own work. The moment Kubek tried to screw in a light fixture, everything went wrong. The bulb shattered, the wiring sparked, and before he knew it, a small fire had started. Panic surged through him as he scrambled for the extinguisher, his hands shaking. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his heart raced. This was nothing like the smooth corporate board meetings he was used to. This was real. This was dangerous. "You're kidding me, right?" Randy's voice broke through the chaos, his face twisted in frustration. "If you're going to work here, you better get your head straight. This isn't a playground." Kubek stood frozen for a moment, realizing how far he had fallen from his high tower of corporate success. His hands, once used to signing deals and shaking hands with the elite, were now fumbling to prevent disaster in a place he barely understood. But he couldn't back out now. The whole point of this undercover operation was to get the truth, even if it meant facing his own incompetence. The fire was quickly put out, but the sting of failure was something he would carry for the rest of the day. The next stop was the call center in Miami. Kubek had been told it was one of the busiest locations for Diamond Resorts, handling thousands of calls each week. As he stepped in, the hum of the phones and the busy chatter filled his ears. But it wasn't the noise that struck him. It was the chaos behind it. Employees were swamped, customers were angry, and the stress was palpable. Sarah, a young agent who had been working there for a few months, was on the phone with a customer when Kubek sat down next to her. He watched as she fumbled through the system, unable to find the booking details. "Can I help you with that?" Kubek asked, leaning in slightly, trying to mask his impatience. She shot him a quick look, clearly annoyed. "I'm good, thanks," she replied curtly, tapping furiously on the keyboard. But the frustration in her voice was clear. She was out of her depth, and Kubek could see it. She couldn't even pronounce the airport code properly. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes about the lack of training. The call ended abruptly, and Sarah let out a sigh of relief. "That's one more customer who won't be happy," she muttered, rubbing her temples. Kubek didn't know how to respond. He felt the anger rising in his chest, not at Sarah, but at the system that had put her in this position without proper training. "Have you been given proper training?" Kubek asked, his voice softer now. She shrugged, a tired smile on her face. "You pick things up as you go. There's a lot to learn and not much time to do it." "Do you know why it's so hard to book a timeshare?" Kubek pressed, leaning forward. "Because the system's a mess," Sarah replied bluntly, "and management's not doing anything to fix it." Kubek's blood boiled. He had come here expecting to find simple operational issues, but what he uncovered was systemic failure. Employees weren't just undertrained, they were overworked and unsupported. This wasn't just a training issue, it was a leadership issue, one that could destroy the brand if left unchecked. His frustration grew throughout the day. At every turn, he found more cracks in the company's operations. In one of the resorts, he was confronted with an underwhelming, outdated guest room that was far from the luxurious experience Diamond Resorts promised. Kubek stood in the room, his mouth dry, feeling the weight of disappointment. "This is what we're putting out for guests?" Kubek asked himself aloud, though no one was around to hear. The frustration was overwhelming, but he knew he had to push through. The last straw came when he visited the check-in desk, where employees like Amanda were struggling to keep up with a flood of guests. Amanda, a bright-eyed, hard-working woman, was doing her best to keep things organized, but it was clear that she was drowning. The room was chaotic, people complaining about missing reservations, overbookings, and long wait times. "Can I help you with something, Amanda?" Kubek asked gently. Amanda looked up, her face flushed with stress. I just need to get through the next few hours," she said, voice shaky. "I'm barely holding it together." Kubek felt a wave of guilt wash over him. These were the people who made his company work, the backbone of Diamond Resorts. And they were being treated like this, left alone, with no real guidance, no support, and no backup. As he watched Amanda handle another irate guest, Kubek knew he had to do something. He couldn't leave this situation untouched. His anger surged as he stood up and walked straight to the office of the resort manager. "This is unacceptable," Kubek said, his voice cold and firm as he addressed the manager. "You need to fix this now." The manager was caught off guard by Kubek's stern tone. "But we're understaffed, and there's no budget for more training," the manager tried to explain. Kubek shook his head, the rage inside him boiling over. "You're not listening. This isn't just about money or staffing. It's about respect for your employees and your guests. You have to make changes, immediately." The conversation with the manager was tense, with Kubek demanding accountability at every turn. The manager's excuses grew weaker as Kubek pressed him further. It was clear that the real issue wasn't just poor management. It was a failure of vision, a lack of focus on the very people who kept the company alive. But just as Kubek was ready to storm out of the office, something unexpected happened. Amanda walked in, her face pale but determined. "I know you're upset," she said quietly, "but I just wanted to thank you for your help. Even if it was just listening, it means a lot." Kubek froze, her gratitude washing over him like a cold wave. The exhaustion and frustration seemed to melt away in that moment. This wasn't just about fixing the company. It was about helping the people who made it work. "I'll do better," Kubek said, his voice sincere. "I promise." He didn't know if he could fix everything. The problems were too big, the stakes too high. But in that moment, he knew he had to try. Because the people who worked here, who struggled every day to keep things running, deserved more than what they were getting. And maybe, just maybe, he was the one who could make that difference. The day ended, but the battle had only just begun. The next morning, Kubek's resolve hardened. He had seen the cracks, but now it was time to dig deeper. He headed to a different resort, this one in Sedona, Arizona. The room he was assigned was outdated, stains on the carpet, peeling paint on the walls. He walked around the property, his heart sinking with every new disappointment. These weren't the luxury resorts he had envisioned when he built Diamond Resorts. Walking through the back corridors, Kubek stumbled upon Randy again. The seasoned maintenance worker was repairing an old air conditioning unit. Kubek approached him, trying to appear casual, but the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. "Hey, Randy," Kubek said, offering a strained smile. "How's it going?" Randy didn't bother looking up from his work. "Same old man, fixing what we can with what we got." Kubek leaned against the wall, observing the worn-out tools, the half-finished repairs. "You think we can do better? I mean, this place, it's falling apart." Randy sighed, wiping his hands on his pants. "You're telling me. But you gotta understand, this isn't just about fixing stuff. This is about having the right stuff to fix it with. You can't patch up a crack in a wall and call it a renovation." The words hit Kubek harder than he expected. "So what do we need?" Randy gave him a sideways glance, as if weighing whether he should speak his mind. "You need money, man, and you need to stop cutting corners. You buy this place, and then you cut the budget on the real stuff. The maintenance, the quality, it's all tied together. Fix one thing, and you gotta fix everything else." Kubek nodded, realizing how little he truly knew about the day-to-day struggles of his employees. It wasn't just about fancy boardrooms and lofty business strategies. It was about making real, tangible changes on the ground. He felt a gnawing sense of guilt. Before he could say anything else, Randy continued, "But hey, that's your job, not mine. I just do what I can." Kubek watched as Randy climbed up to the roof, taking the heavy buckets up one by one. Kubek offered to help, but Randy just shook his head, giving him a grin. "Better stick to your day job, buddy." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Kubek. Here he was, the CEO of a billion-dollar company, and he was utterly out of his depth. Every time he thought he understood, the reality hit him harder. He spent the next few hours with Randy, learning about the complexities of the resort's operations, the lack of staffing, the outdated systems, and the absence of any real training. Randy had been working there for years, but even he was struggling to keep up with the pace. The thought that crossed Kubek's mind as he left the resort was terrifying. If the foundation was this unstable, how could he possibly rebuild the entire company? The training, the resources, the manpower, it all seemed to be slipping away. But that wasn't the end of it. His next stop, the Miami call center. This, Kubek knew, was a critical part of his empire. This was where the first impressions were made, where customers either became lifelong loyalists or never wanted to return. He had been here before, but this time he was walking in as an employee, an outsider. The call center was a mess. Phones rang off the hook. Employees spoke in hurried voices, their words rushing like water through a drain. Sarah, the young agent he had seen earlier, looked worn out. She was sitting at her desk, headphones on, trying to manage a call that was spiraling out of control. Kubek walked over and leaned against the desk. "How's it going?" he asked, trying to mask his own nervousness. Sarah looked up, startled. She recognized him instantly. It's fine. Just busy, you know. Lots of calls, lots of complaints." "Anything specific?" Kubek asked, genuinely wanting to know what she was facing. "Overbookings, missed reservations, things like that," Sarah said, her voice tight. She had been handling calls all day and seemed to have reached her breaking point. "I mean, the system is all over the place. Half the time, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing." Kubek's stomach sank. It was worse than he imagined. The company he had built, his pride, his vision, was crumbling, and it wasn't just the resorts. It was everywhere, from the front desk to the call center. The lack of proper systems, the lack of investment in training, the lack of care for both employees and customers. It was all too much. "I think you need better tools to do your job," Kubek said, trying to sound confident despite the mounting pressure. This isn't working." "I know," Sarah replied, a hint of frustration in her voice. "But no one's really listening. We're expected to do everything, but with half the tools. I get it. You've got the fancy office, the fancy name, but we're the ones on the front lines, and no one cares." Kubek was speechless for a moment. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating. He had been so far removed from the reality of his company's operations that it was almost impossible to comprehend. "Look," Kubek said, his voice softer now, "I'm going to make sure this gets fixed. You deserve better than this." But as Sarah continued with her call, he couldn't help but wonder if his promises were enough. He had seen the cracks, but could he really repair them? The rest of the day went by in a blur. Kubek couldn't shake the feeling that the world he had built was on the verge of collapse. He had always prided himself on his ability to lead, to manage, to drive results. But now it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. He moved on to his next task, working with the front desk team at the Scottsdale Villa Mirage Resort. As he approached the front desk, he saw Amanda again, her bright smile a stark contrast to the exhaustion in her eyes. She was doing her best to manage the chaos of check-ins, but the line was growing longer and the tension was palpable. "Hey, Amanda," Kubek said, leaning against the counter. "How's the day going?" She gave him a tired smile. "It's fine. Busy, as always." But Kubek could see the strain in her eyes. She was only in her 20s, but the weight of responsibility was already pressing down on her. She had told him earlier about her sick mother, and as the hours passed, it became clear that Amanda's personal life was consuming her just as much as her job was. "Are you okay?" Kubek asked, his tone softening. Amanda hesitated, then sighed. "I'm just trying to get through the day. My mom's really sick, and I'm all she has. Some days it feels like I can't handle it all." Kubek's heart went out to her. He hadn't come here to learn about the personal lives of his employees, But in that moment, he understood something important. The people who worked for him weren't just employees. They were human beings, struggling with real issues. "Amanda, I know things are tough," Kubek said, his voice steady, "but you're doing great. And I promise you, I'll make sure we do better. Make sure you don't have to face this alone." Amanda looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I just don't know how much longer I can do this." Before Kubek could respond, the phone rang and Amanda answered. The chaos continued around them, but Kubek stood still for a moment, watching her work. The weariness on her face was undeniable, but so was her dedication. It hit him like a ton of bricks. The company needed to do more for its employees. They needed support. They needed training. And most of all, they needed to know that their efforts weren't going unnoticed. As Amanda finished her call, Kubek placed a hand on the counter, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. This wasn't just about fixing the company. It was about giving people like Amanda a fighting chance. "I'm going to fix this," Kubek said, more to himself than to anyone else. "I have to." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Kubek continued to work with the front desk team, but his mind was already racing with plans to make things better. He couldn't fix everything in one day, but he could start with the people who mattered most, the ones who made Diamond Resorts what it was. As the day came to a close, Kubek sat in his car, staring out at the resort. The view was breathtaking. Palm trees swaying in the warm Arizona breeze, guests laughing by the pool, enjoying their stay. But for Kubek, the image was bittersweet. This wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline for so many people, and he wasn't about to let it fall apart. He drove back to his hotel that night with a new sense of purpose. The next morning, things were going to change. The sun had barely risen when Kubek walked into the resort's administration building the next morning. His mind buzzed with everything he had seen, heard, and felt in the past few days. The employees' struggles, the inadequacies in training, the broken systems. It all weighed heavily on him. But today he was going to make it right. He knew that the company's problems were deeply entrenched. Fixing them wasn't going to be easy, but something had shifted inside him. He couldn't just walk away. He had come in as Jack Pfizer, someone who was looking for answers, but now he had become Stephen Kubek, a CEO with a responsibility not just to the company, but to the people who made it run. As he walked into a meeting with his senior executives, he could feel the tension in the room. They had no idea he had already seen the cracks in their precious system. They smiled politely as they greeted him, but there was an unease hanging in the air, a subtle recognition that he was no longer just an outsider. "Good morning, everyone," Kubek said, taking his seat at the head of the table. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with a new resolve. "We have some serious issues we need to address." The executives exchanged glances, clearly taken aback. "What kind of issues, Mr. Kubek?" one of them asked cautiously. Kubek didn't hesitate. "The systems are broken. The staff is undertrained. The service standards are nowhere near where they need to be. And the worst part is, no one is doing anything to fix it." There was a tense silence. One of the executives, a senior manager who had been with the company for years, cleared his throat. "But we've been following the same procedures for a long time. We've been profitable, haven't we?" Kubek leaned forward, his voice hard. "Profit means nothing if we're losing the trust of our employees and our customers. I've seen it with my own eyes. Your procedures are outdated, your training is inadequate, and most importantly, your attitude toward the people on the front lines of this company, people like Amanda and Randy, is unacceptable." The room was silent now. The reality of what Kubek had witnessed was settling in. It wasn't just about operations, it was about people. People who were working hard, often without the support or resources they needed. "We need to make immediate changes," Kubek said, his tone unwavering. "Better training, better support for our employees, and an overhaul of our customer service processes. We can't afford to ignore this anymore." One of the executives spoke up, clearly uncomfortable. "But how are we going to fund all of these changes? There are costs involved." Kubek's expression hardened. "We'll find a way. The cost of inaction is much greater than the cost of fixing things now. If we don't make these changes, we will lose the company. We'll lose our employees, and we'll lose our customers." The executives shifted uncomfortably, but there was no denying the truth of Kubek's words. After a long pause, one of them nodded, albeit reluctantly. "We'll start looking into how to implement these changes immediately," they said, but Kubek could tell they weren't entirely convinced. As the meeting ended, Kubek felt a sense of both frustration and relief. He had made his case, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real work would start when the employees were finally given the tools and support they deserved. Later that day, Kubek walked through the resort again, but this time with a new sense of purpose. He spoke to employees, front desk workers, maintenance staff, housekeepers, and saw them with different eyes. He understood now. They were the ones who made the company function, and they were the ones who needed his attention, his care, and his respect. Amanda was working again, this time with a much calmer demeanor. She looked up as Kubek approached, her smile tired, but genuine. "How's it going today?" he asked, standing beside her. Amanda shrugged, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. "It's better. I'm getting the hang of it, but it's still a lot to juggle." Kubek nodded. "I know, and I want you to know that we're going to fix the system. We're going to give you the training you need and the support you deserve. You won't have to do this alone anymore." Amanda's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Kubek could see the weight of her struggles in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Kubek placed a hand on the counter. "No, thank you. You're the ones who keep this company going." He moved on to the next team, feeling the shift inside him, a sense of responsibility, but also a sense of power. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was the one who could make the change. That night, he sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on everything he had seen. His anger, his frustration, his hope. It all swirled inside him. He had seen the cracks, but now he was determined to fix them. He wasn't just going to change the company's operations. He was going to change its culture, its values, its very foundation. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. The next morning, Kubek stood before his team again, the weight of the decisions ahead heavy on his shoulders. It was time for him to do more than just talk about change. It was time to show them that he was serious. He called an all-hands meeting, inviting employees from every department to gather in the resort's conference room. As they filed in, Kubek could see the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their eyes. They had no idea who he really was or what was coming. When the last employee had taken a seat, Kubek stepped to the front of the room, his hands resting on the podium. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You don't know me, but I know you. I've seen what you've been dealing with. I've seen the broken systems, the outdated equipment, the lack of support, and I've heard your stories." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Kubek continued, "You've been working hard, doing the best you can with what you've got, but I'm here to tell you that it's not enough anymore. We're going to fix this. We're going to fix the training, the resources, the support, and we're going to do it together." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The employees were still unsure, but Kubek could see the flicker of hope in their eyes. This wasn't just an empty promise. This was real. "I'm also going to give you something else," he said, his voice lowering. "I'm going to give you the respect you deserve. I'm going to make sure you have the tools you need to succeed, and I'm going to make sure you are heard." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kubek could feel the shift in the air, the energy of the room changing. This wasn't just a corporate speech. This was a turning point. He looked at Amanda, who was sitting in the front row. She was listening intently, her expression full of uncertainty, but there was a small spark of belief in her eyes. He smiled, giving her a nod, knowing that this wasn't just about the company. It was about her and everyone else who had been struggling in the shadows. "We'll start by improving our training programs, by ensuring every employee is fully equipped to do their job. We'll also be updating our systems so you're not left handling calls or bookings with outdated tools," Kubek said firmly. "And from now on, you won't have to face these challenges alone. We're going to work together to fix what's broken." The employees exchanged glances, and Kubek could see the skepticism melting away. This wasn't just another CEO giving a speech. This was a man who had spent days walking in their shoes, who had seen their pain and understood their struggles. The meeting ended with applause, but Kubek knew this was only the beginning. It was time to roll up his sleeves and get to work. He would need to convince his senior leadership to invest in the changes, to push through the resistance that would inevitably come. But as he walked out of the room, Kubek felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen the truth, and now it was time to change everything. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a leader who was ready to transform his company and his employees' lives forever. The days after Kubek's speech were filled with tension. Despite his bold promises, the resistance from upper management was mounting. Kubek had seen the cracks in the system, but now it was time for the real battle, changing the mindset of those at the top. These were the people who had grown comfortable with the status quo, and they weren't going to let go of their power easily. Kubek called a private meeting with his senior executives, and it was clear from the moment they sat down that this was not going to be an easy conversation. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. "Steve, I understand your passion," one executive began, trying to maintain his composure. "But you have to understand the financial realities. Changing our systems will cost millions, and we have to be careful with how we allocate resources." Kubek's eyes narrowed. He had expected this kind of resistance, but it still stung. The cost of inaction is much higher than the cost of change. If we don't invest in our employees, in training, in our systems, we risk losing the trust of our customers and our employees. The tension in the room thickened. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with Kubek's aggressive stance. One of them, the CFO, spoke up. "And what about the bottom line? We've been profitable. Why fix what isn't broken?" Kubek took a deep breath. He wasn't about to back down. "You're looking at numbers, but you're not looking at the people. These aren't just financials. They're real lives. Randy, Amanda, these are the faces of our company, not some statistic. We have to change or we'll be left behind." The CFO shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Kubek could see the doubt starting to creep into his expression. It wasn't enough to just argue with logic. Kubek had to make them feel the urgency. "This is not just a corporate restructuring issue. It's about survival, and if we don't evolve, we'll become obsolete." The meeting stretched on, but Kubek's words were starting to take root. Slowly, some of the resistance began to crumble. He knew it wouldn't be a fast process, but he had made his point. There was no turning back now. As the meeting concluded, Kubek stood up, his mind racing. He had pushed as hard as he could, but now it was time to take more direct action. He knew the resistance wasn't just internal, it was in the very culture of Diamond Resorts, and he was going to change that culture, no matter the cost. Later that day, as Kubek visited the resorts again, he could feel the weight of the decisions he had made pressing down on him. There were still employees who didn't trust him, still a culture of fear that lingered in the corners, but he was determined to change it. This was his fight now. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, policy changes, and constant pressure to get things right. Kubek knew that if he didn't act swiftly, the damage could be irreparable. So, he threw himself into the work, making calls to local managers, discussing plans for new training programs, and pushing forward with the much-needed restructuring. But amidst the chaos, there was a breakthrough. The employees, who had initially been skeptical, began to notice the changes. It started with small shifts, new uniforms for the maintenance teams, updated systems for the call centers, and better support for the front desk staff. These were tangible improvements, but they were just the beginning. Kubek took the opportunity to personally address some of the employees who had stuck with him throughout the changes. One of those employees was Randy, the maintenance worker who had opened his eyes to the underlying issues at Diamond Resorts. Randy had been working in the same resort for over a decade, and the work had taken a toll on him, physically, mentally, and emotionally. One evening, as Kubek stood outside the resort, watching the sunset over the desert horizon, Randy approached him. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the changes hanging between them. "You've done good, Steve," Randy said finally, his voice gruff but sincere. "You've turned things around. I didn't think you'd be the one to listen, but you did. You're making a difference." Kubek looked at Randy, a deep sense of gratitude filling him. "I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me the real problems, and I won't forget that." Randy nodded, his expression softening. "Just keep it up, okay? We're in this together. Don't let it slip away." That moment, standing side by side with Randy, was the turning point Kubek had been waiting for. The promises he had made were starting to become a reality, and the employees were beginning to see the change. This wasn't just about making the company profitable. It was about making it a place where people felt valued. But Kubek knew there was still much work to do. There were still more employees to reach, more systems to overhaul. and more broken parts to fix. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, he felt confident that he was on the right path. As months passed, the company began to feel the effects of the changes Kubek had implemented. Diamond Resort started to regain its former luster, but this time, it wasn't just about luxury or prestige. It was about creating a company culture that valued the people who made it successful. Kubek's leadership had transformed the company from the inside out. The training programs were revamped, and employees were given the tools they needed to succeed. There was a new emphasis on customer service, and for the first time in years, the company's reputation was beginning to improve. Amanda, who had once been overwhelmed by the demands of her job, now stood at the front desk with a renewed sense of purpose. She had received the training she needed and felt empowered to make decisions that would improve the guest experience. Randy, too, had noticed the changes. The maintenance team was finally given proper equipment, and the workload had been more evenly distributed. He no longer had to shoulder the burden alone. As Kubek stood in one of the resort's newly renovated rooms, watching guests check in with smiles on their faces, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. The changes were working, and he had no intention of stopping now. But the real victory, Kubek realized, wasn't in the success of Diamond Resorts. It was in the people. The employees who had once felt invisible were now valued, and they had a real stake in the company's future. Kubek had rebuilt more than just a business. He had rebuilt trust. He stood there, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, knowing that his legacy at Diamond Resorts was now one of transformation and hope. The road had been long, and the struggles had been real, but in the end, the company was stronger than it had ever been. And for Kubek, that was the greatest reward. As he turned to walk away, he knew this was just the beginning. The real work would continue, but for the first time, he felt confident that Diamond Resorts was on the right path. The final shot lingered on the resort as the night fell, the lights of the buildings twinkling in the distance, a symbol of the rebirth Kubek had fought so hard to achieve. And as the credits rolled, the message was clear: real change is possible, but only if you're willing to face the truth, confront your flaws, and take action.